About the author. Deborah Lukovich, PhD, is a coach, writer, and speaker. Her midlife unraveling coincided with a calling to study depth psychology, and the boundary between theory and personal experience was blurred many times. Her midlife reconstruction paralleled her research on women's experience of reconciling sexuality and spirituality, and the reward of exploring her unconscious came in the form of a new sense of purpose and creativity that was unleashed when she picked up and moved to a beach town. As a coach, she is passionate about helping people come into deeper relationship with themselves and uses a framework based on C.G. Jung's theory of individuation. She teaches her coaching clients how to recognize and decode the messages of the soul, sends through the unconscious in the form of dreams, synchronistic events, symbols, film images, complexes, fantasies, obsessions, and even anxiety and depression. As a writer, Deborah offers equal parts entertainment and healing by weaving in her most awkward experiences to create space for others to explore their own. Through her blog posts and short stories, her mixture of conversational instruction sprinkled with humor guides readers through information, stories, and practical approaches to self-reflection. Deborah is working on a memoir inspired by her midlife experience and research on women's experience of reconciling sexuality and spirituality. To learn more and subscribe to receive notifications of blog posts and updates about her writing, visit www.deborahlukovich.com. Now that's D-E-B-O-R-A-H, not D-E-B-R-A, DEBORAHLUKOVICH.com. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Reading Circle microphones, Dr. Deborah Lukovich. Deborah, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for such a nice, warm welcome.
Well, thank you for joining me this morning, because I know if you're in Central Time, you are an hour behind me. So while it might be 7 o'clock here, it is 6 o'clock there. So thank you for rising early to be with us. Your book is Your Soul is Talking. Are You Listening? 5 Steps to Uncovering Your Hidden Purpose. All right, so let's go back before we even get to this point. Let's kind of go back to where did this begin, because it sounds like some revelations came forth as you now went on your educational journey. But in school, going all the way back to high school and undergrad and so forth, did you consider yourself to be an author, or was that your intent to one day ultimately write books?
Oh, interesting. I enjoyed writing, and I actually enjoyed different types of artistic expression when I was young, but they were frustrated, I guess. I have 2 younger sisters who are really incredibly talented, visual artists and a voiceover actress, singer. And so it's interesting, part of midlife unraveling is sort of circling back to childhood and remembering what you had forgotten about yourself. And, it wasn't until my unraveling of reconstruction that my artistic expression was freed. Now, I had written a couple of books before, but sort of on boring topics like fundraising. So my soul book is much more personal. And a year ago, I also launched my own podcast. And as I was swept up in the experience of creating this podcast, as part of my mission to grow my movement of self-reflecting humans, I recalled a memory from childhood of my sisters and I playing with one of those old-fashioned tape recorders where you could plug in your phone, and pretending that we were like game show hosts. So out of the blue also comes like this desire to be a podcaster, and I'm loving it. So,
well, I read whenever I was doing your bio about synchronicities. And listening audience, the fact that Deborah's on here, Dr. Deborah's on here this morning was a synchronicity. We actually hooked up on LinkedIn. We linked up on LinkedIn.
Yes.
And she had taken note of my bio and had reached out to me in a message. And I saw exactly what she was saying about the podcast and the book and everything. I said, well, I'd like to have you as a guest on the show. And that's how we got here this morning. But it was very interesting in terms of how you were talking about kind of imagining, and I remember those tape recorders, imagining being a talk show host or either TV show host or game show host or what have you. I was just sharing this morning how this is June will be 22nd year on the air in the same booth. Thank you. Now, Dr. Deborah, this is how that started. I was a campaign manager and I'm going to give you the real Cliff Notes short version. I was campaign manager for a friend of mine who was doing an interview at this particular station, and they had a sign on the bulletin board that says, "Do you want a radio show?" And I was out there in the lobby just yelling out loud because I didn't think anybody was there. I thought I was by myself. So I was literally yelling back out, "Yeah, I want a radio show. Yeah, I want a radio show." 2 weeks later, somebody comes up to me and say, "Why didn't you call me?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "You said you wanted a radio show. I'll put one together for you." So I won't go into all the details, but 22 years later, I'm still sitting here. And it came from me just yelling out into the universe, if you will, or into the atmosphere, answering a sign that was hanging on the bulletin board. Yes, I want a radio show. And lo and behold, I wound up with one. I'm saying all that to say, I'm not surprised that you wound up now being the podcaster that you visualized as a child with the old tape recorder.
That's your story is a perfect example of synchronicity, which Carl Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, described as sort of the coming together of the inner world and the outer world and how it works to get your attention. So you might not have noticed that sign. Many people didn't notice that sign, but for you, it was an image presented and mirroring back to you that connected with something inside your unconscious to produce this moment of, oh, yes, how did you know? Basically, right?
That's absolutely right. I didn't even know the station manager at that time was in the building, let alone for him to see me 2 weeks later, remember me and say, "Why didn't you call me?" And I'm like, "Who are you and why would I be calling you?" But
and you know what else? I'm going to teach you some depth psychology.
All right.
Hermes, the Greek god known as a guide of souls and also as a trickster and a messenger, he was there as well because a sign that was a pretty clear question presented to you by the unconscious. And
correct.
Hermes has been a constant companion during my midlife unraveling and reconstruction and unleashing, because Hermes is sort of at the edges of your consciousness. So when your unconscious is sort of calling you forward, sometimes you'll resist, and then sometimes he'll orchestrate events to say, like, "Hello here, do you hear me? I have your attention now?"
That's absolutely right. And it's interesting because I am a wordsmith. So as I'm listening to your choice of words when you say, most people associate the word midlife with midlife crisis. I'm hearing you say midlife unraveling.
Well, you know what? It's usually, in most cases, it is some kind of crisis that spurs, and then you have a choice to make. Do I want to unravel? Which is really a choice. I mean, there was a time when that dream about my teeth falling out and crumbling, I don't know if you're familiar with that dream, but it's a common dream. And I came to understand later on that it wasn't of course, my life is falling apart right now. It wasn't that. It was that I needed to allow my life to fall apart. But I don't like when people shy away from the word crisis, because what midlife crisis is a crisis of meaning. So you wake up one day or something happens to you, there's a death, there's a divorce, there's a cheating, there's a whatever it is, and you tell yourself, like, who am I? Who's that person? Who did I marry? Like, everything I thought was true is not true anymore. And that is a literal crisis. So, I know that people like to sort of shy away from it, but it is true that real transformation is sort of forced. If you just wake up and go, "I'm going to transform today," that's your ego. That's not actually real transformation. That's education, that's gaining knowledge, but it really is true that a sort of crisis is what prompts the journey, and some people will accept the call, of the hero, and other people can't or aren't willing or don't have the capacity or the courage to be able to answer the call, and then they try to sort of, deal with it in other ways.
Absolutely. So I was reading, I'm going to read from chapter 1, The Discovery of You, kind of along the lines of what we're talking about. And you're absolutely correct. A lot of times, and I said this earlier, some of us wind up being in a situation we're in by choice and others by force. And it's interesting that you just said, usually force is what causes us to have to make these different choices.
Yeah.
So chapter 1, The Discovery of You. Do you really know yourself? I want to get you excited about exploring the most important final frontier, your inner world. Like an iceberg, most of you is unknown, and just as the artifacts found by archaeologists help make meaning of the present, exploring your own life can do the same for you. Making sense of your current life will influence your future in ways you never imagined. Can you get through life without this depth of self-reflection? Now, we're going to talk about self. That's why I'm reading this. I want to get into self-reflection. Sure, and many do. Others reach a time in life when what used to make sense doesn't anymore. Your patterns of thinking and behaving are what helped you survive and thrive up until now, but eventually some of those ways of responding to life's events stop working and start holding you back. If you don't recognize them, you will feel frustrated by the why certain things happen in your life, and you won't understand that it is not necessarily others holding you back, rather a glass ceiling of your own making. The way you approach life now is a stepping stone to growing into the next version of you. Have you reflected about why you believe what you believe? Did you adopt your parents' religious beliefs, or did you run the other way? What does your annoyance with certain people say about you? Are you the black sheep in the family? Why did you become a lawyer or a community activist? Do you know the real reason you got married? If you're struggling with alcohol, have you wondered what you're really craving? Do you wonder why that thing your mother always says makes you so angry, or why you can't help saying hurtful things to your sister? Do you know why you're obsessed with certain Netflix shows, or why you cannot watch enough superhero movies? Have you figured out what that recurring dream wants from you, the one where a plane crashes? Have you had the dream where your teeth are crumbling, or the one where armed militia are chasing you through your childhood home? Why do you feel fear when someone expresses misogynistic ideas, even if you are not in physical danger? What is your earliest childhood memory? Now, this is just the first, part in chapter 1. I want to unpack this because we're talking about self-reflection here, and so few people do it. Let's talk a little bit about that.
So, doesn't it seem like such a basic concept?
Yes.
But it has a bottomless pit, which makes it kind of a paradox. I love paradox. So I think there's different levels of self-reflection, but a lot of self-reflection, I think, might be done through the mind. And the ego, which gets a bad rap, right? Our ego is necessary. Our ego is sort of a guard to the unconscious, which can be a really scary place. Our ego helps us manage the tension between our what's in our unconscious, which we don't know what's in our unconscious. That's why it's unconscious, and fitting into the world. So if we simply self-reflect through the mind is always looking for affirmation and confirmation. Even when we're like, I'm going to be open today to what life has to offer me, if we filter it only through the mind, we're just looking for affirmation and confirmation of what we already know. So when I teach self-reflection, I am teaching people how to allow another part of them to speak to them, because the unconscious speaks to you all day long through emotions, conflict, dreams, obsessions, even your anxiety and depression, like I said. And if we can be open and learn the language of the unconscious, we're tapping into a wisdom that is different than the mind. Now, when we have these experiences and we explore the images without the mind, then we bring in the mind to go, oh, okay, well, what is the meaning of that experience? What is anxiety trying to say to me? Oh, I just gained a new insight about myself. Now what do I do with the insights? That's when we bring the mind back in. That's, okay, what do I do with this new information about myself? So that's how I approach self-reflection is, and the unconscious, the language of the unconscious is, you could also say it's the realm of the feminine. And I think most people realize now that feminine doesn't mean woman. Feminine and masculine are sort of styles of consciousness. Using the mind is of more masculine. Using the feminine is more meandering and mysterious and image-oriented. And so, with my approach, you sort of learn how to be more fluid and aware of this whole other source of wisdom that is accessible by you.
So as you were just talking about that fluidity between feminine and masculine, is that kind of like the yin and the yang?
Yeah, definitely. So in depth psychology, we might say there's styles of consciousness, meaning ways of existing and finding meaning in your everyday experience. And so we're very familiar with, trying to make rational sense of things and using our reason and, 2 + 2 = 4 and that sort of thing. But then we're missing out on the mystery. And innovation and creation comes from the unconscious. It doesn't come from the known.
Correct.
So for those who don't have a practice, and I call this a practice, a spiritual practice, really, they're just missing out on a lot. They're just missing out on a lot of fun and juicy potential experiences.
So in terms of, it says like your soul is talking, are you listening? A lot of times people, myself included, we will do something and it will go counter to what, quote unquote, we call our first mind. We say, dog, my first mind told me not to do that and I did that. And now I got these bad results because I didn't listen to my first mind. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
Well, it's really that little inner dialogue that you just had, a little argument with yourself, is a great place to start. Because often I used to think I knew when my intuition was speaking to me, and right. I didn't. But I didn't know. So sometimes you might have this little twinge, and it feels like, oh, I'm going to listen to that. That's my body. That's my intuition. But that little twinge actually could be the pattern or the complex that we don't want to use anymore. And so that whole process and journey of really discovering what your soul, or what you could say yourself, your capital S, this sort of part of you that's kind of leading you, but it's all in how you sort of respond to its calls to you. So it's not like, not a predetermined place your soul is taking you, but it's offering you little messages and little clues, and I call them little breadcrumbs. So, yeah, so that's why I said, like, I could study myself now I'm going to study myself for the rest of my life. It just sort of never ends.
Well, it's interesting because one of the questions, especially in part 1, was kind of like, do you know yourself? Do you know you? And most people would probably say, yeah, I know me. But in reality, we really don't.
Well, and also for those mind people, science and neurology really confirms that as much as 90% of who we are, the decisions we make, why we're attracted to certain people, is influenced by mysterious unconscious forces. So if you're a science person, sorry, you don't know yourself. You only know maybe 20%. So even a simple act of like I just bought this car. I just bought this watch. This is why I bought this watch. Nah, there's a hidden agenda. There's another reason that you don't realize why you bought that watch.
Now, all right, I keep hearing you talking about the conscious. Now, let's talk a little bit, because I understand the whole thing in terms of subconsciously, because the subconscious, from what I understand, is always active, even if the conscious goes to sleep.
Well, yeah, so the I don't know. Unconscious is just, well, the thing about the unconscious that's so vast is that we have a personal unconscious, and there are things in it like memories and actual events that we've just tucked away. There's also things that we've repressed, so we don't allow to come up to the surface, or suppressed on purpose, because we're like, oh no, I just don't want to remember that I did that last week. I feel such shame about it. Like, oh no, stick that in the closet. Or, some trauma from childhood that we've locked away. But we also, our personal unconscious also contains potentials. So a lot of people tend to view the unconscious, we might call it a shadow too, the shadow, as a negative thing, but it also has potentials that we refuse to claim about ourselves. So, part of the reason I think I didn't pursue creativity when I was younger is that I had two really authentically talented sisters. And so I developed a little artist complex. And it only was like one little event that happened where my sister got all the attention. I was like, nope, I guess that's not for me. So that's another thing in my unconscious, is an undeveloped creativity that didn't come out until later. And then to make it even more complicated, our personal unconscious, it also exists within the different collective unconsciouses, right? So we have a family. We're part of a family. And so there's not only our conscious awareness of each other, there's also an unconscious family dynamic. And then we are part of neighborhoods and communities and countries and companies. And then we're part of the whole collective of humanity. And C.G. Jung suggested that just like we have a biological DNA, where the whole history of, life on Earth is sort of represented or somehow reflected in our biological DNA, he believed the same thing about our psychological experience, a kind of psychic DNA, that part of the collective unconscious contains all psychological experience of humanity. So sometimes really, really interesting and odd things will come up from our unconscious that really have nothing to do with us personally, but really look back to our ancestry, or even groups of people that, we don't have a personal connection to them.
So are we using unconscious and subconscious interchangeably, or are they two different things?
I don't really know how to answer that question. Don't ever use the term subconscious. It might be a more detailed term for something specific. So I think people can sort of look at it how they want. If, as I describe unconscious, it feels like, oh, that feels like subconscious, then that works too.
So I'm looking here in your bio. You're talking about reconciling sexuality and spirituality. And I noticed that in here, you were pretty much focused on women's experiences, but is the same, do men have that same experience? Or talk to me a little bit about what is reconciling sexuality and spirituality.
Well, yes, men experience the same thing. I have many men, actually, that my dissertation is on my website. So if anybody wants to read my research, they can just download it as a PDF. And I had a man reach out to me and say, oh my gosh, now I have a name for what I've been going through. So he really right. It was a woman's experience, but the dynamic that I was describing was so familiar to him in his own life. So what does that mean? Reconciling sexuality and spirituality. There's so many different levels to it. On a personal level, I came of age in the 1980s, and it was a really specific, part of a really specific generation that there felt to be so much hope and progress for women specifically. So in the 80s and 90s, I witnessed like the first woman law partner, or the first woman this, the first woman that, like just so much overcoming was happening. And it was also happening sexually, right? So women were feeling empowered after having access to reproductive services and health care, which is the main way we can determine, how to live our lives. So anyway, so there was all this progress and this hope, but there was also like a backlash against it, against women's sense of independence, especially sexually. So, during this time where women were like, well, I can have sex too. There was this backlash in these movements that sort of started to really demonize women who were trying to break out of those molds. So from a personal standpoint, there were mixed messages that I absorbed into my body that I thought I had said, well, I don't care what you think. I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to, follow my life and the way I'm going to write my own story, basically. But at a certain part, you can't ignore those messages that you sort of, so I went on to live my life, and I got married. I started businesses. I actually started a nonprofit that was focused on young women, and it wasn't until my marriage started falling apart, and it actually fell apart, that I discovered this hidden motive or a hidden reason that I had married my husband, who I loved. But I discovered that I had married him as a way to save me from the chaos I was experiencing in relationships and sexuality. So that's sort of where it comes full circle. I didn't really reflect about coming of age in the 80s and 90s until things were falling apart in my midlife, and I found these little themes, these little threads. And it was really just sort of gentle ways my unconscious got my attention that led me to begin to eventually discover that, whoa, these two things are something that have really been at war inside me personally, and then eventually it took on more collective meaning for me, communicating this to other people as well. So, yeah, and on a bigger level, what are those two things? So sexuality and spirituality are two really big topics in the world, right? And they manifest in a lot of extreme ways. So when it comes to sexuality, for example, there's almost this for some, there's this rigid and uncomfortable experience and denial and repression of sexuality that goes along with really rigid views than spiritual views, right? And then on the other end, we've got an anything goes approach for spirituality and sexuality. So those two huge human instincts seem to be in opposition, and my midlife experience was about bringing them together. And and this will be all in the memoir, the juicy part of the story, like how did that happen? It happened through various relationships that were presented to me, and that swept me up.
So are you familiar with the law of attraction?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of the law of attraction, how much, and I heard the reason this question came up because I heard you say the word manifest. How much of what happens and comes to us in our lives manifests based on kind of like in terms of how we're thinking? I mean, it's kind of like they say thoughts become things. So, how much of that is tied in with this work, or is it?
Well, it's just another lens through which to look at things. So, yes, thoughts become things, but actually that book, that Law of Attraction book, is a really basic understanding. It's incomplete because it's not only thoughts, it's feeling, right? So if you don't have the emotion, so let's say you're like, I'm going to have a great day today. If you just wake up and say, I'm going to have a great day today, like, you might not have a great day. But if you're like, I feel great in this moment, even if I'm faking it, but I'm really faking it well. I actually feel good in this moment, so I'm going to have a great day. So, another way to look at the reconciling is the body and the mind, right? So the mind thinking, and then the body communicates to us as well. So, yes.
Correct.
The lens that I use is how not only I guess a big way that I've changed how I exist is in the first part of my life, I had used a very masculine style of consciousness, meaning I knew what I wanted, and then I sort of manifested, I guess, right? So I said, I want to start a business, or I want to whatever it was, and simply setting the intention sort of put something in place, right? So then my thoughts were leading me, and because it felt good and I was excited, I could do those things. Well, part of my midlife falling apart is I didn't know anything anymore. I had to let go of everything I thought I wanted. I let go of all goals, and that was really difficult to do. And so the difference in how I'm living now is I'm allowing and I'm receptive to the guidance of this inner part of me, myself, my personal unconscious. And what that is doing for me is leading me to also allow creative intelligence out there in the world and the universe to use me as a vessel for the good of humanity. So do you see the difference? Like the way the first part of my life was very very mind-oriented, very linear, very working forward. And now I'm in the realm of the feminine, the realm of mystery and meandering. And when you get to that place, you really are rewarded. And for me, the reward always came in the form of pleasure. And so I always know I'm on the right path when I just feel this sort of pleasure that feels arousing, but it doesn't have to do with literal sex. It has to do with creativity, with creativity that has more meaning than just my personal thinking and goals about the creativity.
That leads me to my next question in terms of out of your bio again. Did you teach your clients how to recognize and decode the messages the soul sends through the unconscious in the form of dreams, synchronistic events, symbols, film images, complexes, fantasies, obsessions, and even anxiety and depression? And see, which goes back to the question I just asked about law of attraction. A lot of times whenever we're in a scenario or a situation, it really does seem like you're getting hit with messages all over the place. I saw it on a billboard. It was on a TV show. I heard it in a song. Talk a little bit about that.
Just the messages that you get during the course of your day.
Yeah, just about like what you were talking about in terms of, in that part of your bio where you're talking about the synchronistic events, symbols, film images, complexes, fantasies, obsessions.
Oh my gosh, so much fun. Well, the most common way I help my clients explore their unconscious is through dreams. So a client might bring a dream. Well, let's take one of mine, for example. At a certain point in my midlife, I knew I was getting divorced. So that part of that was over. I had done some online dating. That was really interesting because each of those dates was like a life course. And so I sort of pursued the dating as a way to learn more about myself. I really wasn't looking for a life partner. I was just like, okay, I have to learn how to relate to men all over again because I was married for 24 years. And so I was really open to coming into deeper relationship with myself through these encounters. And then there was a break. And then, I got swept up in a relationship with a younger man. And that's where my sort of sexuality and spirituality came together. But at a certain point after, I would say, about 6 weeks of getting swept up with that man, I had a dream, and it was an embodied dream, meaning I felt it really deeply in my body. In the dream, I was in a state park bathroom. And, they're just made out of concrete, basically, concrete and wood. And it was dark. And I had gone to the bathroom, so I was done, because in another phase, I had lots of dreams about toilets. So in this dream, I had already gone, but it was dark, and I couldn't see my way out. I had to feel my way out. I scraped my shoes on the floor, put my hands out in front of me. I found the door. I opened it, and then I fell backwards down a hill. And it was in slow motion, and I tumbled, and then I stopped, and then I tumbled, and it was dark. It was so dark I could not see anything. But I noticed that there were leaves that were falling, freshly fallen, in this little warm gust of air. And I had this feeling of safety I had never had in my life. I had never felt that kind of safety. And when I woke up, I did not want to leave that feeling of safety. And it stayed with me for so long I could slip back into it. I decided to draw that dream. I didn't know what it meant. I decided to draw the dream. And then I allowed my imagination to prompt me to draw a pair of hands underneath the drawing of me tumbling backwards down this hill. And I felt like it was a kind of connection with a more archetypal mother. So it was this feeling of safety. Now, I still didn't know what it meant. And the next day, I went on a hike, actually, at a state park with this man.
Okay.
And I had my first feeling of insecurity about the relationship. It was like a devastating kind of insecurity that I hadn't felt up until this moment. This dream went on to have more and more meaning over time. So fast forward about a year and a half, I went back to this dream and I was like, whoa, what that dream was assuring me and affirming that I was going to take a tumble, but I would be safe. And after the tumble, that I would be okay. And so the embodied nature of it put that in me. And so from that point forward, that relationship was nuts. Actually, it was crazy. And so it was true that at the end of it, I had gained great insights about myself, and that, again, the purpose of the relationship was not to be permanent. The purpose of the relationship was to facilitate the sort of inner reconciliation for me that then unleashed me into the world as a different human being. So
wow.
That's a long answer, but I'm just trying to sort of share a real example of this is what I teach my clients. For example, a dream like that, and then of course I have a specific method by which we explore the images. But that sort of insights that I gain for myself are the sort of insights that my clients by the end of the session will be like, oh my gosh, I never realized this before. And we couldn't have gotten there through the mind, because the mind will just go on a little hamster wheel and you won't get anywhere. But when you open up to the language of the unconscious, you get there faster, even though it's a more indirect and meandering route.
Now, that's interesting, because I was saying before you came on the air that this weekend I was actually watching, and I'm not a reality TV person. However, I did watch a reality show yesterday that was called Married or Move On. And within the episodes, there are like 6 or 8 couples, and one of the partners has given an ultimatum. Either you marry me or we're going to move on. And they go on this retreat, and the 8 couples choose between the partners of the other couples that are there to spend 3 weeks with, to see if being with somebody else, what that will do for them. Is somebody else that I feel would be better or a better fit or whatever. But in that process, exactly what you just described is what began happening to the couples, to the partners. They began to really see what was going on within them. It wasn't so much about what the partner was or was not doing. It really was about what was going on inside of them. So that example you just gave, it sounded very similar to that. It was also interesting that you said sometimes relationships are just not meant to be permanent. And many times, we go into relationships saying, yeah, this is the one, this is permanent, death do us part, so forth and so on, when in reality, sometimes it's not that.
Right. And expectations really get in the way. So I discovered this framework on a walk. When I walk, my unconscious speaks to me pretty loudly. And I had a client who I have been seeing her for months, and she had a conflict with her partner. And she said, will you sit down with us? And I thought, okay, how do I start this session so that there's like this level playing field and that we can all see through the same lens? And I came up with something that I call the 3 Ps. And this is my framework for helping people think about relationships in a different way. Because romantic love actually evolutionarily is kind of a modern thing. And this is my thinking, but we used to project a lot onto, let's say, God, right? So conventional religion has really been losing people, right? And so it's almost like we and now people are trying to find their own spirituality,
right.
But it's almost like people have taken what they used to project onto God and they project it onto this magical other person, right? That can't possibly live up to those.
Right.
So my three Ps are, my first is that there is always purpose to every encounter. I call them encounters because we don't know if they're going to last, but whatever the encounter is, there is a purpose that you really aren't aware of, a deeper purpose. And the reason for your attraction is that it's your unconscious is like, yep, this person is going to help me teach you this lesson. And so the purpose is growth, always. The second P is projection. So we relate through projection. We project our lens onto other people's, or we project our whatever we want to deny in ourselves, we'll find that very attractive in another person. And so what is the purpose? Well, to get you to see that. But the third P is what really messes a lot of relationships up, and that's the idea that this must be permanent. So especially for my clients who have come out of a long-term relationship, and they didn't really take a lot of time to sort of work on themselves before they got into another relationship, they'll start seeing these, what they call red flags, because of course they didn't really disrupt the patterns. So the patterns they're taking into their next relationship, but they will really judge themselves and they'll be harsh on themselves and they'll say, oh my gosh, is this just me? And what ends up happening is that they carry too much of the burden. And so they actually, because of the fear that they might they might damage the relationship, they're not honest about what they're feeling. So they can't really explore it with their partner. Instead, they just sort of internalize it. So if you can, and this is really hard, but even in your current marriage, if you can let go of the fear of it ending, then you can be honest, and honesty really increases the likelihood that the relationship will last. So it's like if you give up on the idea that something will last, it's more likely to last. It's a really beautiful paradox. But if you cling to this notion that this must work, you're not going to be honest, and you'll just feel it, right? There'll be tension, there'll be resentment, but you won't really know it'll be beneath the surface until it sort of unleashes like a volcano. So I really love working with my clients on relationships, and I suggest to people to be curious, to just be curious about what's happening, about the emotions that you're feeling, to linger in them, to slow it down, and then reflect about what's going on here with me. And it's not to excuse bad behavior on the other parts, but always you're meant to learn something about yourself.
Now, there's that adage or cliche or whatever it's called about if something is meant to be, set it free, and if it comes back to you, so forth. So if it doesn't, it wasn't meant to be, so forth and so on. Is that kind of like what you're talking about?
I kind of like that. Yeah, it's okay, this is here right now. Let's be present with it. Let's linger in the experience and not really worry about sort of, the end game. And yes, and if you do that, you're just open to what each experience and encounter has to offer you. why does it, even ask yourself, why does this need to last? What is that about? Is that a fear?
Wow.
Being alone?
That's interesting. Like, why does this have to last? That was an interesting question.
Right.
Because in terms of, again, the first time I saw this particular reality show was yesterday. Never seen it before, and then wound up watching like 8 episodes of it. But it was called Married and Move On. And that pretty much what you've just been describing was kind of like the premise of the show. Was, well, okay, I thought you were the one, but for whatever reason, you don't want to commit, and so let's see if there's something else out there. And then, they ultimately, there was out of the 8 couples, 2 of them ultimately did wind up getting engaged to be married, and it left the other 6 couples that were still on the fence, and they had the opportunity to explore and see how it was like with somebody else. And it really did cause them to self-reflect. It was interesting for them to say, well, you know what, I really don't know what I want. I thought I knew what I wanted, but I really don't.
Well, and we're so influenced by larger forces, conventions that tell us, like, what is right and what is wrong. And, finding your own truth is for the brave.
Right. You say finding your own truth is for the brave. I might have to post that and put your name under it. Finding your own truth is for the... I might have to put that on Facebook and put your name under it as a quote.
Oh, I love it.
Finding your truth is for the brave. I'm going to put that under Dr. Deborah.
Yeah, because your truth often is not in alignment with what other people think.
Correct.
You should be doing. So... And it does take a lot of courage to go against that, because we have, this need to be accepted by people. But,
correct.
Who's the most important person that needs to accept you? It's your being and God, if you have a relationship with God.
Right.
I'm pretty sure God doesn't want you to be lazy. He wants you to find your truth. So.
Correct. So talk to me a little bit, especially in this day of mental health and mental illness, and because I see in the bio it says, and even anxiety and depression. Because, anxiety, particularly, or more so depression, is, there's a whole lot going on that folks don't know what's going on, and ultimately sometimes if it's unchecked, you may wind up snapping. Well, talk a little bit about how anxiety and depression fits into this as well.
Oh, my gosh. Our emotions and things like anxiety and depression is a significant way our unconscious speaks to us. So what is anxiety? Anxiety makes us, uncomfortable. It makes us worried. It makes us, we feel on edge. And I recall James Hillman. James Hillman is the founder of archetypal depth psychology. Mm-hmm. And he wrote this book called We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Getting Worse. And so he says a lot in that book, but one of the things he says I really love, and that's that we've personalized mental health. So it's your problem. Maybe you can blame, your childhood trauma, mother, whatever, and then you go sit in a private little cell with a therapist in his office or her office, and it's all about, like, you. It's your responsibility to figure out your own mental health. Well, excuse me, but we exist within the context of a society
Correct.
that is imposing a certain way of living that's not working anymore. So the fact that so many people have anxiety, that's to be expected and to be actually just to be accepted. Like, sit down, anxiety. Let me have a talk with you. What are you asking of me? And, there's such high rates of anxiety and depression and ADHD and Gen Z. I wrote an article about what is Generation Z mirroring back to us. Anyone who is going to be judgmental of Gen Z just sort of being paralyzed, angry, anxious, depressed, they're so blissfully ignorant. It's disgusting. Like, honestly, you don't know why Gen Z is anxious? Really? I mean, just look around. They
Correct.
don't want to be shoved into your
Correct.
capitalist system where capitalists don't even care about you. Like,
Right.
so you're going to like judge them because they don't want to go be a slave for corporate America? Okay, I get, all right. So, so anxiety, what is anxiety asking of us right now? Well, first of all, it's not just you. And so people need to have compassion for the way that the emotions that are overtaking them right now in this crazy world where everything's sort of being dismantled and people have to kind of rebuild a new way of looking at how to exist in this world. So when I work with my clients who have anxiety, one of the ways that I teach them the language of the unconscious is we'll take anxiety and we'll do something called active imagination. The image is the language, right, of the unconscious. And imagination, that's direct from our unconscious. So when you're like, okay, I'm going to try to clear my mind and see what comes up, boom, that's a message from your unconscious that gets presented to you. So what I'll do with my clients is I'll do some breathing with them. They'll close their eyes. I'll have them settle into a lower level of consciousness. And I will ask them what anxiety looks like and where it is in their body and what color it is and has it taken a shape and is it a memory or is it a person? And I will facilitate sort of their following their imagination to try to relate to the anxiety and to say, hey, anxiety, I see you. You're part of me. I'm not going to resist you because that just makes it worse, of course. But do you think you could sit over here so I could see you? Can you sit over here? Can I just put you over there so I can see you and we can talk and I can understand more about what you're asking of me because I don't understand what you're asking of me. And that has amazing, where it goes with clients is so different. Some people feel immediate relief from anxiety. And other people, like me, when I have a dialogue with my anxiety, it sometimes comes out in a creative way. One time it came out in sort of a prose poem that reminded me that, hey, I'm a rebel again. I'm trying to grow this movement of self-reflecting, humans. When you're a rebel, that means you're doing something different. You're going against the grain and you're creating something new, and that comes from the unknown. So remember, okay, you're fine. So I'll get, a dialogue with my anxiety will help me sort of get over what hump I'm having. But, it's the same thing with depression. So my approach is, and obviously people, sometimes need medical intervention, right? Like
Correct.
They might need an anxiety medication or something like that. So I always want to say, I'm not saying not to do that. But what I am saying is that there is something waiting and the anxiety is trying to communicate something to you. And sometimes the reason it's uncomfortable is it is asking you to step out of convention. It is asking you to do something that you have a resistance to because maybe there's fear or maybe there's whatever. But, relating to these different emotions gets you further than resisting them and locking them sort of in a closet and trying to get away from them. They'll keep chasing you.
Correct. Well, listening audience, we're down to the last couple of minutes of our interview. I hope you've been with me the whole time. We've been talking with Dr. Deborah Lukovich, or we can say it the other way, Deborah Lukovich, PhD, or Dr. Deborah, or she said Deborah, whatever you'd like to call her. We've been speaking to her this morning about her book, Your Soul is Talking. Are you listening? 5 steps to uncovering your hidden purpose. That's what we've been discussing for the last hour. Down to the last 5 minutes or so, I usually shut off the microphone and I allow my guests to promote. Dr. Deborah, you can say anything with the exception of a dollar amount, but in terms of any shout outs or in terms of how people can get in touch with you, your websites, your blogs, podcasts, you get a chance to promote. The only thing you can't promote are dollar amounts. They can figure that out whenever they reach out to you. So I'm going to shut the mic off and you take it away from there.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark. This has been a really fun conversation. I could talk about this stuff all day long. People can find everything about me on my website, DeborahLukovich.com. At the top are all my icons to go to my YouTube channel, where I actually do have a video on how to have a dialogue with your anxiety, also how to explore your dreams, and videos on what is depth psychology coaching. Also, you can get to my podcast. You actually can listen to my whole book for free at my podcast. I have each chapter is in a different episode. I love being a podcaster, really interesting conversations. And then, I call my style creative memoir. So I always work in my own experiences as I'm trying to bring depth psychology concepts to life. And then the last thing I will say is that I really do have a new sense of personal mission to grow a movement of self-reflecting humans. So C.G. Jung suggested that the fate of humanity depends upon the self-reflecting individual, and I really do believe that. And so I just want to empower more people to do the kind of self-reflection that will eventually help us unleash something new into collective consciousness about how to live as a human being.
Well, I thank you so much for rising early out there in Milwaukee. And are you on Facebook?
I am.
You are? Okay, I'll send you a friend request before the day is out. But I also record the show, and I will get the MP3 link and the YouTube link to you. And once you get those links, you are free to share them with anybody and you'd like, because they are yours. But I do archive the show for those who did not want to rise early with us on this morning. So I thank you so much. Definitely insightful, definitely enlightening. And yes, I agree with you in terms of more of us need to self-reflect. And for those of us who do self-reflect, we probably can continue to get better at it. But I really do think, because you're right, we are so easy to project onto someone else. We're as opposed to working on ourselves. So I could not agree with you more. I want to keep track of the movement of getting more folks to self-reflect. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to be with me this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care. We will be in touch.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.